Am I audible? Can everybody hear me? Good.
You are audible.
So, I really like the title that Justin gave this. Israelis, foreigners versus invaders, or foreigners versus natives. I don't recall exactly what he said, but pretty much the reason I wanted to talk about this after I'd completed the Fuel for Truth program and after a few conversations I had with Justin was because I grew up in South Florida. My whole family is Israeli, and specifically we're Sephardic Moroccan Israeli. So we grew up in a community in which everybody kind of had a very similar background. There was really no question as to whether or not Jews had any kind of claim to Israel. It was sort of a given. Predominantly because there were so many people in my neighborhood and in my communities that had either served in the Israeli military or had fought in one of the Israeli wars or had fled persecution from a surrounding Arab country to Israel. And so sort of the idea that Jews didn't have a claim to the land didn't really, it wasn't something that was discussed really. Not that it wasn't present, but it wasn't something that was a topic of conversation routinely. It wasn't really until I went to college that I remember a bunch of conversations, specifically with, organizations that were either sort of it was right when BDS was sort of, getting some traction. And it was right when, there was an organization, I think called like Justice for Palestine organization that came up, as well as a bunch of Students for Democratic Society organizations, pretty much predominantly left-leaning organizations that whenever, I'd interact with them or talk to them, because I had friends in those groups, they would immediately, pose me the question on Jewish claim to Israel, which was, what right does, say, Esty Marcus, for example, have in Brooklyn to Israel? What right does anybody in a region outside of the Middle East have to Israel? And I feel like they really do win the argument there. They win the argument predominantly because it's so clear, it's so color-based, and it's so color-coded. The reality is, the majority of the time when in the West you think of a Jew, you think of somebody from a Western European, maybe Eastern European country. You think of somebody who predominantly looks white, looks European. And when you're thinking of the narrative of how peoples get invaded and how peoples get conquered, it's predominantly white conquering colored. And I thought that the parallel that was being drawn to Jews in Israel was the same parallel that was being drawn, that they were sort of piggybacking off the parallel in the United States, where Native Americans were invaded by Western European invaders and by Western European colonists. And now the Palestinians are sort of the modern day indigenous people, the modern day native people. And they wanted that argument. And I sort of had to think about it for a while. And I realized that, the question that, or the idea that sort of started, trickling in my mind was, does the public perception of the Western European Jewish caricature, the caricature of a Western European Jew, has that really been the thing that's contributed to the narrative for the Jew being the invader in Israel? Meaning, if the caricature were the opposite, if the caricature in Western pop culture or Western media was that Jews were predominantly Eastern in origin, were predominantly from the area that Israel is surrounded by, predominantly the Middle East, would the narrative really hold water that there are a bunch of European colonists coming into the country, or would it be something different? Would it be framed as sort of like a public, or not public, but sort of like a local skirmish among warring factions within the same region? So take that idea, put it to the side for a second, and the parallel I want to draw is actually with something slightly related, which is the Comanche Nation. I don't know if any of you are familiar with sort of Native American history, but United States, there were about 4 dozen different Native American nations, and that's what they're called, as nations. They're called nations predominantly because they have distinct cultures, they have distinct claims to distinct parts of the country, and they also are have very distinct languages and distinct religions. But there's one that really stands out, and that's the Comanche Nation. The Comanche Nation is, in your mind, when you think of what a Native American looks like, you're probably thinking of a Comanche. It's somebody who's very dark-skinned, very broad features, very strong, on horseback, riding into battle with bows and arrows. The Comanche were known on the plains parts of the United States as being the undisputed kings of the plains, the lords of the plains. That's actually where that phrase comes from, lords of the plains, because they viewed themselves as sort of kings of that territory. It's really undisputed with regard to the Native American history that they're by far the most merciless and bloodthirsty nation on the Great Plains. They slaughtered and decimated, thousands, if not tens of thousands, Native American nations in that area, specifically like the Apache, the Cherokee, the Kiowa. They really did take into town, and they're in large part responsible for the halting of Western expansion via the Monroe Western expansion as it was viewed from the Monroe Doctrine. They really took American soldiers to task on the plains. But when we think of Native American history, we don't think of the internal conflict that happened within the boundary of the United States prior to Western involvement. We think of Native Americans, and in many ways rightfully so, as being the victims of Western expansion. But we don't ever think of Native Americans having their own regional issues. We don't think of how, you know, they fought for territory amongst themselves, how they waged, you know, long and very bloody wars amongst themselves, how they violated, you know, mutually agreed upon boundaries, how they invaded other territories, how they took over other territories, how they expanded their region, how they expanded their borders in order to, you know, further their particular cult and their particular cause. And I often wonder if Ben-Gurion or if Herzl were of the area, were Moroccan in origin or Iraqi in origin. For example, if Ben-Gurion were like Ben Abu, or if Herzl were Harari, would there really be as strong an argument to be made that Jews are foreign invaders as opposed to being native from that region and now simply returning to the area from which they were previously expelled? That was really the thrust of my you know, wanting to do this type of talk, is sort of to get other people's opinions on it. You know, I don't know that there's going to be a massive change with regard to how people view, you know, Jewish claim to Israel, but I do think that it's important when you have these conversations with people to frame it in a way that I think is a little bit more palatable, not palatable, but a little bit more digestible to most people, which is, you know, when you're saying that what claim does somebody from the United States, what claim does a Jew from the United States have to Israel, you can say, okay, fine, you know, let's take that aside for a minute, but what claim does somebody, say, from Morocco or say from Iraq? What claim does a Jew that was expelled from Israel to a surrounding Arab region have to that? Is it more valid? Is it less valid? Is it something that makes for a more distinct narrative or a less distinct narrative? And it's very important when you're having these conversations to remind people that, you know, Jews are not a monolith, that they have cultures and customs that are varying even amongst similar regions and even amongst similar ethnic groups. And when you're talking about, you know, are Jews native to Israel, you should really, I think that we should move away from, or at least not focus so much on whether or not they're native to Israel, but rather native to the region. Predominantly because of the lines that were drawn in the Middle East after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, you know, they essentially didn't really serve a significant purpose other than to divide up the land for, you know, Western European countries after World War I. And the people that lived in those lands either did or didn't have significant respect for those boundaries. And when you're talking about, you know, those areas, when you're talking about the Jewish claim to Israel, it should, in my opinion, be a much broader conversation. It should be broader regionally, and it should be broader geographically. You know, bring up the fact that, you know, one of the largest populations of Jews outside of Europe was actually in the Middle East. It wasn't in South America, it wasn't in North America, it wasn't in Eurasia. That you know, there were significant numbers of Jews in Iran, there's a number of Jews in Iraq. And when I say significant, I don't mean that in sort of a castaway way. I mean, the population, by some reports, are over 400,000 Jews in Iraq and like 150,000 Jews in Egypt. In Morocco alone, I think if you count, there was like one census done like in the 1930s or something. There were over, I think, like 250,000 Jews in the entire region of North Africa. And, you know, it's important to remember that those people have a claim to Israel just as valid as Western European Jews. The only difference is that Western European Jews kind of beat them to the punch. And that's in large part because the conditions in Western Europe and the conditions in Eastern Europe were so much worse than the conditions in the Middle East for the Jews during World War II. You know, it's almost sort of a function of how good things were in the Middle East up until the creation of the State of Israel, that Eastern Jews really weren't that involved in the First World Zionist Congress. And if you're curious about it, I'd encourage you to go look up the original speakers list for the First World Zionist Congress, and you'll see that, you know, almost all the delegates, with the exception of two, are from either Western European countries or Eastern European countries, predominantly Russia. And there's actually one delegate, I wrote his name. His name is Jacques Bahar, who represented all the Jews of all of North Africa. There's that one delegate that represented. And that just tells you sort of, what presence, Eastern Jews had and North African Jews had during the original creation of the State of Israel, and why, the original impression of the first Olim to Israel are, white Europeans and not originally, brown Easterners or African or Middle Eastern. And that's really the predominant thing I wanted to sort of get across. And if you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. And I'd like to sort of have this conversation be something that you guys take forward and keep in the back of your mind when you're engaging with people who sort of bring up whether or not, Jews have any legitimacy to the area.
Thank you. Here, actually, I'd like to start off kind of with a question, maybe kind of get people's mental juices flowing. Very much in line with what you're talking about, as far as the, obviously you were branching into the greater history of Zionism. That obviously it was a Jewish project from a very Eurocentric perspective. That obviously the European nationalism of the late 19th century, early 20th century very much influenced Herzl, Jabotinsky, obviously even Ben Gurion for that matter. And that's obviously, how Zionism was formed as a sort of a political movement with its objectives. What would you say as far as, once that was obviously implemented in Israel itself, how much do you think the influence of its founders, and certainly the discrimination and the sidelining of both Sephardic and Mizrahi culture, kind of really fed into sort of this stereotype that you've been discussing, or this misperception? Along with the fact that very much in a very paradoxical way, even with Israelis, the first Israelis, and I'm saying predominantly the Ashkenazi Jews, like recognizing themselves as from this region, this being our ancestral homeland, very much wanted to fit in with Europe, to be white, to be European. That's a bit of a paradox, no?
Yeah, so there's a few things to unpack in that. I would say the first thing is that the original founders, when they were, so there's this interesting sort of anecdote that I don't know if it's true or not, but it's become almost apocryphal with regard to Ben Gurion, is that when they were discussing where to sort of recruit Jews from after World War II, in order to bring them to Israel, they actually took a map of the world, and they apparently drew circles all over European countries and completely neglected the areas that are right next to Israel, like Morocco and Iraq and Iran. So I think that in the original conception of what Israel was going to look like, I think even though there was obviously a need after World War II to have a homeland for fleeing refugees from the Holocaust, there was never a thought that Israel would one day resemble its surrounding Arab region. It was almost thought that Israel would be sort of a Western outpost in the Middle East that would have, European sentiments, that would have European culture, and would sort of be this, unique place where European Jews and European Jewry could sort of flourish to some extent. And maybe there was a thought that Israeli culture would develop as an outspring of that. The irony of all of that is that today, the majority of the population of Israel is growing more the census data isn't really there, but predominantly as people who self-identify, most Israelis self-identify as either Mizrahi or Sephardic or mixed, which tells you that Israel is slowly but surely looking more and more like its neighbors. And I think the argument that the surrounding regions have that Israelis are just a bunch of Europeans who invaded and took over the country is going to hold less water as they start having conversations with Israelis and realizing that, oh, this person grew up speaking Arabic, or this person grew up speaking Farsi. And I think a stark example of that is actually, I think like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, there was some Zoom meeting where, it wasn't a Zoom meeting, it was like a Zoom event that Israel hosted where they gave an award to volunteers. And the woman who received the award was actually this 91-year-old Moroccan grandmother who after the whole award was given, she actually had a whole interview with somebody in Moroccan Arabic. And that was specifically because, she connected with that. It was a way that was easy for her to speak. The interviewer spoke Arabic, coincidentally, which also was interesting because she's Israeli as well. And as people watch that, it's going to be harder and harder for them to say, oh, Jews are just a bunch of Europeans living in Israel, as opposed to having some sort of native connection of that land. I don't know, there was a second part to your question.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember specifically what I said. I think, it kind of came with sort of like that, that first Israeli desire to be part of the West, not the East, to be European, to not be, Middle Eastern. And certainly the I think this has been sort of used by certain Israeli politicians to show, like, to indicate like how civilized and developed and how like the West they are and not like their neighbors. They've used like sort of this prerogative like phrase typically like
Yeah, but isn't that
we're the villa in the jungle.
Yeah, but isn't that so patronizing? I mean,
Incredible.
to say, yeah, I mean, it's like, I'm saying, isn't that so patronizing to imply that, that the Middle East needed a bunch of European Jews to come and sort of civilize the region, to the implication being that the surrounding area wasn't civilized, or that civilization didn't hold a candle to what European civilization held. I mean, I think that type, I mean, I'm not accusing you of that, obviously, but
Yeah.
I feel like that type of sentiment is really what's contributed to the greater Middle East saying that the Jews don't belong to that area. Aside from sort of the superficial things that why the European Jews don't look like they're from the Middle East, they may not want to look like they're from the Middle East. Now, I would argue that today there's sort of this outspringing, that there's sort of this outpouring of a desire in the area for Israelis to sort of hold onto their own culture and to identify it as both distinct from Arabic, but clearly native to the area. The same way that Persian culture is distinct from Arab culture, but it's still native to the region. And the same way Moroccan culture is distinct from African culture, but it's still, nobody would claim that Moroccans aren't African, they're just North African. And I think that's something that needs to happen more and more. And as, I'll tell you this one last thing, as both Zionist apologists and also people on the BDS movement and people who are anti-Zionist start interacting more and more with the second and third generation of these North African and Middle Eastern immigrants to Israel, like myself, like people that I grew up with, it's going to be much harder and harder for them to say that these people don't belong to the area, that they're somehow totally foreign the way an Italian is foreign in China. I just don't see that holding water in the next few decades.
Mm-hmm. We have someone who's asked a question through the Q&A, and just a reminder for everyone, obviously, if you want to contribute to this, or if you have a particular question you want either myself or Leon to address, please do so this way. This question, or it's more of a comment, but it's something we can discuss. Yeah. The state of Israel and U.S. have benefited from Sephardic Jews, their ability to speak Arabic and to know the Arab cultures. Good examples shown in the movie The Spy and also Fauda. So, I mean, we can obviously take that questions, but feel free.
Yeah, it's great. It's awesome. Fauda is a great movie. I love the TV series The Spy. I think it surprised. I'll be honest. When I was in the hospital, actually, one of the nurses asked me if I had seen the show The Spy, and she asked me, "Man, it must have been so hard for that Jewish guy to learn how to speak Arabic." I'm like, "Yeah, did you realize that you spoke Arabic?" So, like, I think it's stuff like that is going to be more and more helpful, obviously, to push that narrative forward. And as people start connecting that, being Jewish doesn't inherently imply that you're not native to that region, then the argument that Jews don't have a claim to that land is going to, fall short more and more. And it's something that I think we should embrace. It's something that even if you're not, by the way, even if you're not Sephardic, even if you're not Mizrahi, you have as much a claim to the land as a Jew from that area does. I just think that if you want to sort of fight the conversation, or you want to fight the claim that because you don't look like that area, you don't belong to that area, it's very easy to refute. You say, well, look at this. Look at I don't know, make a very Mizrahi name. Look at Michael Harari or David Garazi or whatever. Look at these people. I mean, they clearly speak the language. They know the culture. If you go to their wedding events, they're very similar to a lot of Middle Eastern weddings. Their food is very similar to the Middle Eastern food. They had no connection they have as much of a connection to the United States as any other immigrant does. Why wouldn't they have a connection to Israel the way any other immigrant does?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. You're making me think also, and we've talked about this in boot camp before, but the idea of indigeneity and the idea of like what's the expiration date for a connection or belonging or rights or responsibility to a particular territory and civilization. And you had mentioned Native Americans before. Like, at what point, did they, or had they not been put on reservations and they were just massacred outright? At what point would they, stop being, quote unquote, Native Americans? At what point would they stop being part of the tribes that you discussed? Same thing with Jews.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's a good question. I think that the reason that it's not an easy question to answer is because nothing like this has ever been done before. It's not like Native Americans were taken from North America, put in Australia, and then brought back to North America through an inherent desire to sort of reconnect with their lost land. They were sort of pushed off the land by either warring factions or colonists from Europe that then became Americans. I don't know. I don't know that there is an expiration date. I think as long as it depends on there's like this international definition of what it means to be indigenous. If you look at that definition, there is no time frame associated with it. It's just that something like the Jewish experiment has never really been done before, and I don't think it's ever been applied in the extremes that it's been applied now. Meaning, do people continue to be considered indigenous 2,000 years after they've been kicked off their land? I don't know. I think they should, but interesting conversation to have. There's a cool question about Ethiopian Jews. Yeah, I was thinking about that. I mean, I don't have any problem with it. I mean, it's the question: do I have a problem with Ethiopian Jews? I don't, but
I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I'm doubting that. Maybe in terms of like how they kind of fit into sort of like that narrative, or at least the questions we've been asking as far as like, how perception of like who are, and granted, I obviously can't speak of this from personal experience, but obviously there are a lot of Ethiopian or Black Jews or even dark-skinned Jews that, when people find out they're Jewish, the first question is like, oh, did you convert or were you adopted? Right, that type of discrimination that comes with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, I think, to remember that even though there are those who discriminate in Israel, I don't think that Israel structurally is a country based on discrimination. Like the same way there's racism in the United States, I don't think America as a whole is an inherently racist country. Obviously, Ethiopian Jews nobody will argue that Ethiopian Jews have had an easy time in Israel. It's definitely getting better. They're more and more integrated society than they were when they originally came to the United States. I think like in the late 80s, early 90s. It's getting better. I think they have as much of a claim to the land as any other Jew does. Obviously, I mean, I'm happy and I'm excited every time I see an Ethiopian Jew speak Hebrew and wear an Israeli uniform and proudly take part in what they feel is their birthright, and they should be integrated and fully embraced in Israeli society. There's another question here from Ross. I guess what contributes a bit to the sense of Europeanness in Israel is the form of government and kind of a Western approach to civil liberties, medicine, technology, etc. Would you agree with that, or is that a form of subconscious bias, or are those Western values also Jewish values that became fundamental in Europe? No, that's a really good question. The reality is probably mixed. I mean, the reason that Israel has a predominantly Western bias is probably because at the time it was a former British colony. So a lot of the institutions that were built within the country, similar to the ones that were built in India, have British structural influence from them. The way the school system was built, the way the bureaucratic system were built, they sort of model sort of a British system. And then obviously, of course, a lot of the immigrants that originally came over were from Western Europe. Now, those biases, I don't think are necessarily bad things. It's not a bad thing to sort of adopt another system. What I think is bad is sort of claim that those that are living in that country and using that system are now of that system and from that system. The same reason no one would claim that Indians learning in a British system in India, following British separation from India in the 1940s, in the 1940s or 1930s, would claim that Indians are British. They're rather just sort of a result of a hodgepodge of influences. One of those influences being Western. If there was no Holocaust, would there be the nation of Israel? I think there would. It just probably wouldn't have happened as quickly. Because listen, I mean, I don't know who said it, but I think it was like Rahm Emanuel who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think the Holocaust was a good crisis that the Jews definitely capitalized on in a good way, and sure that it didn't go to waste, because it's very difficult for the refugees of the Holocaust. It's very difficult for Western leaders who weren't involved in helping the Jews during the Holocaust, or weren't that involved in rescuing as many refugees as possible, to look a bunch of refugees in the eyes and say, you don't deserve something that would have likely prevented your own extermination. So I don't know that I'm fairly confident that Israel would have happened. It just probably wouldn't have happened as quickly.
One thing I just want to add to that also, because I think that very much gets offered as sort of an accusation that Israel is just this European project. It was sort of this compensatory apology gift for massacring 6 million of us in Europe. So therefore, we're going to give you this slice of land in the Middle East. And one of the things when you dig deeper into Zionism and you learn more about the Zionist movement, and obviously this comes with the different personalities, the organizations, and the efforts to obviously build this country, it very much came in sort of the duality of both top, bottom sort of infrastructure building, like many of the infrastructures that we know today, whether that's the Jewish Agency, Jerusalem Post used to be called the Palestine Post, same thing with the post office, the Histadrut, like all these, proto-state institutions were being built by Jews on the ground during the British administration. Some obviously even predated the British when it was still part of the Ottoman Empire, but also it was very much a bottom-up effort. And if you look at a lot of the resistance groups that certainly fought the British, whether that was the Irgun and the Lehi, but also during this period that you obviously had, what was a proto-Israeli military being formed both by those two underground movements fighting the British, but also, through the creation of the Haganah and a more of a structurally sound armed movement, many of whom certainly fought in both the First World War and the Second World War wearing British uniforms. So all these sort of top-down and bottom-up components of statehood were, in my opinion, going to be an eventual reality in creating the state of Israel. Certainly the Shoah had a unique impact in terms of how the outside world was sympathetic to the Jews at the time, and that obviously played some helpful benefit in what would come obviously through the 1948 war and certainly further state building afterward. But I think the creation of the modern state of Israel just through the Zionist project and what had been going on already in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, and obviously the 40s was going to be an eventuality anyway.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And just to be clear, I didn't mean to imply that, that the Jews in any way, try to, I don't know, not trivialize, but sort of use the Holocaust as a chip in order to gain something in return. I strongly believe that Israel would have happened regardless of the Holocaust. I just think that it was one more tool or one more thing or one more way that the Jews were able to sort of make their argument that there was necessity to have a Jewish country. And it's very difficult to sort of not, in my mind, if you're going to claim that the Holocaust wouldn't have happened that Israel wouldn't have happened without the Holocaust, you're sort of negating the vast majority of Jewish history, which included pogroms ranging from the Kelniki massacre all the way to Mani pogroms, dating back all the way to the Jewish to the Spanish Inquisition. So there were multiple other things that could have happened. There were multiple other, atrocities that happened to the Jews that didn't generate and that didn't result in the development of the creation of the state of Israel. It's sort of that the Holocaust was sort of the last thing that sort of came together. It was sort of the last thing that was on people's minds when the Zionist organizations were coming together to try to petition or try to lobby for the creation of the state of Israel. Now here, there's a long comment by Michael. I encourage everybody to read it, but I think the thrust of it is that the conversation should be more about, how all Jews, regardless of them being European or Mizrahi or Sephardic, have a claim to land. Absolutely. I'm in no way trying to minimize that. Every Jew has equal claim to the state of Israel and has equal claim to what it means to be Israeli. I was simply stating that, it's important to remember that people that are fighting against Israel score an easy win when they say that it's that a Jew living in New York with Ashkenazi origin, meaning with a European background or a European sounding last name or a European look, clearly has absolutely no connection to the state of Israel. I think that's blatantly false. But you're letting them get an easy win by letting that slide. Instead, you should say, okay, fine, you know what, we'll put that aside for a second. So that means that all you need to do to have a claim to the state of Israel and be Jewish is to look like you belong to that area. Okay, fine. What about all these other Jews? Do they not have a claim because they look like other people from that region, or do no Jews have a claim to Israel? And then I think you sort of reveal their own bias isn't really about the fact that Ashkenazi Jews are from Europe and Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are from the Middle East. It's rather that they're just simply Jewish and they don't want any Jew to be living in the Middle East, specifically in Israel.
Yeah, and here, just to piggyback off your point with that, it's very interesting, obviously, with, sort of today's conversation about race, about color, how there seems to be like a very like sort of very like a binary, like hexadecimal, like litmus test. That if you are on this side of like, the hexadecimal, you are white or, privileged or light. And if you're on this side, you are dark, you are brown, you are, subjugated. When obviously these societies in the Middle East obviously are not monolith in terms of skin color and tone and like obviously how they relate to each other, just like you have obviously very light-skinned Jews, of Syrian origin. You also have very dark olive looking Jews who spent the majority of their diaspora experience in Poland and Russia. obviously there are Palestinians and Syrian Arabs who are both very light-skinned. No one would say you are less Arab or less Middle Eastern because of that.
It's funny though, it's always ends up coming back to skin color, because I think that there was this really, I remember reading this article when I was in college about like what it means to be black in the United States, and how in the United States specifically, being black has almost everything to do with how dark your skin is, period, regardless of whether you're from Haiti or Jamaica or Africa or not. The degree to which you are perceived as being black is exclusively related to how dark your skin is, meaning the darker you are, the more black you are, the more legitimacy you have to being black. So I always think that it's funny how, something that you have no power over, something that doesn't really impact and doesn't really tell anything about your background story, is the thing that most people like to catch onto. And I think that reveals their inherent biases and how they're really trying to get a very cheap and easy win by claiming that because you are light skinned, you can't be from that area. Well, that's completely silly. There are light skinned Hispanics, there are dark skinned, there are dark skinned people from European countries. I mean, there's the whole spectrum of ethnic and religious and Jewish experience on every country. And I think somebody that brought up Ethiopian Jews, I think, is a very good point. Somebody that brings up European Jews is a very good point, that Jews are often perceived as being a monolith. And my original point has sort of the perception of Western European Jews, and that the dominance of that caricature has that sort of impeded our ability to make sort of the easy win argument, which is that not all Jews are from Europe, and even the ones that are have a claim, but what about the ones that are from that area? And okay, there's a question from Jonathan. Is there an issue of Ashkenazi Jews not connecting in their own minds that they are in fact descended from the land of Israel? How can we help Jews bridge that disconnect? What about emphasizing the various paths by which Jews ended up in Europe? Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think that's a really good point. I mean, again, this is another anecdote, but I remember, at least as a kid, if you'd go to sort of these pro-Israel rallies, or you'd go to organizations or groups that were having sort of protests, and on the opposing side, if there would almost always be some Jewish presence on the opposing side. It was usually like an American Jewish organization in support of the Palestinians, or an Israeli organization in support of the Palestinians. I don't, and again, this is my own bias, I don't ever recall seeing somebody who was Mizrahi or Sephardic on that side. I almost always recall it being somebody who either wanted to disregard their connection to the land of Israel, wanted to disregard the fact that they belonged to that area because they felt it was easy, or because they just didn't see it as plain as maybe I did. To me, I always felt very clearly connected to Israel, and I think somebody who maybe didn't look like they belonged to that area would feel that they immediately didn't have a connection to that area. That's totally false. Just because you don't look like you're from that area, you obviously have a connection to that area. I think that Ashkenazi Jews should absolutely own it, be proud of it. I mean, the Ashkenazi Jews are the reason that there is a state of Israel in many respects. Without them, there wouldn't be the current, long Israeli history that we're very proud to sort of own, and that my grandparents are very proud to sort of to claim themselves as being Israelis because of the work that many Ashkenazi Zionists did in the beginning. I don't know if that sort of answered your question, but I totally agree that emphasizing the different ways that Jews entered into the diaspora period is very important, and not telling people, but sort of enlightening them into how they're also from that area, just like every other Jew is from that area, is crucial in having them move the mental ball further in their head towards, yes, they're from that region.
Seeing one question here in the chat from Ben. I'll just read it out loud here. There are a few common mindsets I've found among both some Israelis and Westerners. How do you recommend people address these when hearing them in public? Meaning, you're a white kid from New Jersey. Why are you trying so hard to live in Israel? Why would you, or vice versa, why would you as a Sabra want to live in America? It's a miracle you can be in Israel. So it seems obviously there's sort of a paradox of expectation depending on who the person is or where they're from.
Are you trying? Yeah. I mean, that's a decision you have to make for yourself. Why you want to live. Let me reread the question. How do you recommend people address these when hearing them in public among both some Israelis and Westerners? If you come to mind, I found why are you trying so hard to live in Israel? Why? I run into. I mean, I know a lot of Israelis that would. I know a lot of Israelis, my family included, who are desperately trying to leave Israel, trying to come to the United States, who want to sort of come to the United States for economic opportunities, for educational opportunities, et cetera, just because it's easier in the U.S. Why do you try so hard to move to Israel? I mean, at the end of the day, in my mind at least, there's not a strong economic or political or there's not a strong monetary reason necessarily to move to Israel. It has to exclusively be because you feel a connection to the land and you want to live there, because you feel that it's important that you be a part of it. I think if you're trying to sort of justify, why harder. First of all, you don't have to justify your reason to live in Israel to anybody. If you want to live in Israel, go live in Israel. But why would you as a sovereign want to live in America? I don't know. I mean, people have reasons to live in every country in the world. I mean, just because you're Israeli doesn't mean you have to live in Israel. I mean, people leave their countries of origin all the time. I'm just not 100% understanding the question, but people leave countries all the time. The same, maybe this is it. Maybe because Jews are so intrinsically connected to the land, why on earth would they decide to leave that land? Yeah, there's that aspect too. But then there's people's personal life. People want to live wherever they want to live. People need to move wherever they need to move to, and it's not necessarily that they maybe want to live in America, but maybe they have to live in America for whatever reason, either family, personal, financial, or whatever. I don't know if that answered the question exactly, but I would say that if you want to live in Israel, that's your priority. You don't have to justify it to anybody. If you want to leave Israel, that's your priority too. You don't have to justify it to anybody.
Aliyah and Yerida are both complicated enough questions in Israel.
Yeah. Cool.
Seeing one other question here at the bottom. How would you like to respond to people who put down Jews who okay, I think we kind of addressed that with actually the last one. Here, actually, up at the top, Michael Mantel was saying that he recently got into a discussion, currently an ongoing conversation, where someone has stated that the Holocaust was used by Jews to claim rights to the land. While I know where you were coming from, especially how it may have accelerated the process, he, sort of cringes when he hears this. And, maybe I'll kind of just point out one thing, that obviously what we do through Fuel for Truth, through boot camp, is obviously a lot of it is also really kind of training yourself to, I'm not sure if, desensitizing yourself to these issues is really the best way of looking at it, but certainly for you to obviously be able to control those emotions rather than them controlling you. And that is obviously a skill like any other that certainly requires practice.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, again, whenever people try to, at least in my opinion, whenever people try to bring up the Holocaust to try to, whenever the Holocaust is used as a debate point to minimize Jewish claim to the land, or to in any way cast shade on how Jews got Israel, or how Jews were able to sort of grow Israel, you can say, okay, you know what, fine. If you want to claim that, I think you're sort of playing hide the ball. You're saying that the prior to the Holocaust, everything was great for the Jews, and they always felt very at home in Europe. They always felt very at home in other parts of the world. And it was really the Holocaust that was sort of the anomaly in Jewish history. And that's just not true. And that person making that argument is being totally ignorant to Jewish history. If there ever was a people who needed the protection of a country and everything that it brings, is the Jewish people. I mean, there's no other group. I'm sort of preaching to the choir. There's no other group that's experienced as much systematic, repeated, and consistent persecution from the country that they lived in. The United States has really been. The United States is really not the example. The United States has really been the exception, not the rule. And I feel that the experience of Jews living in the United States is really something that has never really repeated itself. It's something that I don't think would ever repeat itself other than in Israel. We don't do ourselves any favors by thinking that history stopped existing. That history didn't exist prior to the Holocaust. It's important to always remember your Jewish history and remember that. Just because it wasn't videotaped doesn't mean it didn't happen. And there were multiple times when Jews needed the protection of the state of Israel and it didn't exist. And, if it weren't for Israel today, who knows how many terrible atrocities would be going on against the Jews, because I can assure you there's no lack of Jew hatred in the world today.
No, sadly there isn't. And yeah, very much to your point, obviously people, either deliberately or, like you said, more often than not, due to ignorance, obviously they're obviously selectively working with, the pieces of information, the puzzle pieces they have at their disposal. And by obviously framing them, arranging that limited information to make a picture, that tells the story to them. But if that's all you're working with, it's an incomplete picture. And,
right.
On top of that, social media today, information silos, everyone's got a 15-second attention span in which, most people today, you ask them, as far as, this whole conversation or accusation, why doesn't Israel just give back land? Why doesn't it just go back to the 67 borders? We'll have peace. There'll be a Palestinian state. We'll have kumbaya. When, most people, like when you begin to respond as far as talking about disengagement from Gaza or disengagement from southern Lebanon in 2000, most people have no idea today that Israel had a 18-year occupation of southern Lebanon. Yet that
Mhm.
obviously very much tells a part of the story that's really critical to understanding Israel's relationship with its Arab neighbors, and certainly why or why not it will or will not make certain decisions at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree. Completely agree with that.
So here we have, I want to make sure we are ending on time. If there are any other questions, please add them to the Q&A while I kind of just wrap things up. Leon, thank you so much for doing
Oh
this.
yeah, it was my pleasure. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I can tell everybody if you participate in Fuel for Truth or thinking of participating in Fuel for Truth. Has everybody here already done Fuel for Truth?
I'm recognizing a lot of names here, so I think
Yeah, I really enjoyed Fuel for Truth. I think it was an awesome experience. Getting to know Justin was obviously great. Getting to know other people in the area was great, and it's something that I think is important and something that if you feel any connection to the state of Israel and you want to do something that will sort of heighten or hone your thinking skills and sort of hone your argument skills, I think it's an important class to take and an important experience to have.
Yeah, and Bezrat Hashem will be able to be doing boot camp in the future in person again. Let it be soon, let it be now. But thank you again for doing this talk. This was really eye-opening. Even for me personally, I really enjoyed hearing your perspectives on this and really being able to kind of like facilitate this dialogue, even given the circumstances we're all dealing with. Obviously, we'd love to have you back to do more of these talks. And for all those who are obviously still looking to be a part of these webinars, you can continue to see the most updated lists that we have on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/fuelfortruth. In the events tab, we will constantly update them, as well as through our emails. So if you are not currently subscribed to FFT's emails, please go to fuelfortruth.org. You can subscribe from there. But if you guys have any other questions about anything we've discussed tonight or anything else, feel free to contact us at info@fuelfortruth.org, and we're happy to get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Everyone have a great night.
Yeah, you as well.